actually talking about multiple systems in our body. First, starting with the bone marrow, right? So that's the skeletal system. And the white blood cells and red blood cells actually congregate there. So we have some of that going on. But we also have a lot of the endocrine system and the lymphatic system. Mainly the spleen, the thymus, and pretty much a lot of other stuff too. We'll talk away from the waves. According to the NIH, not only is the bone marrow with the white blood cells the bloodstream, so we have the bloodstream too, which we'll get to next because that's huge when we talk about inflammatory response, whether it's acute or chronic. We also have the thymus and the spleen. So the thymus is the endocrine system and the spleen is the lymphatic, but the whole lymphatic system is involved in our inflammatory response with something that are known as lymphocytes. I don't know if I'm saying it right, but we'll call it that. But there's also our skin and the mucosal tissue. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We're also going to get into the difference between acute and chronic inflammation and how one kind of leads to the other and your body's response and how that starts to degrade over time. Also of importance is talking about the nervous system and the autonomic response within our bodies and how everything kind of works together to help formulate the inflammatory response. Part of that is our sympathetic nervous system. That's the fight, flight, freeze, or collapse. That one's huge because it actually goes through, the whole autonomic system goes through branches in the spleen, the thymus, and the lymph nodes. So when we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system, we have the adrenal cortex, which is responsible for the cortisol. And what happens with the cortisol is that kind of like decreases our immune system response, like we're more susceptible to stuff. But then at the same time, we also have the adrenal medulla that has the epinephrine and non-epinephrine, and those are working at the same time to keep it in balance because our bodies always want to be in harmony and balance. So along with that, the adrenal medulla also does the lymphocytes, right? Part of the lymph system that keeps everything in check. But if we start to look at the yoga of things, the parasympathetic that rest and restore, and if we are thinking about restorative types of yoga, we actually release, I'm gonna butcher this, I'm gonna be real, acetylcholine. It's some kind of neurotransmitter in the brain, but when active, it actually strengthens our immune system. And that happens when our parasympathetic nervous system is kicked on. So we have kind of like two types of inflammation that we see. We have acute, and then we have chronic. And chronic is the stuff that we see commonly in the United States, right? Like a lot of people have inflammation of the gastrointestinal tract. Arthritis is also inflammation. But when we're talking about the actual biology of it, it starts with that acute sensation. So what does that mean? That means like, hey, I sprained my ankle and now my whole ankle is inflamed, right? Or I get a cut and all of a sudden it's puffy. So that's the kind of inflammation that we're going to talk about first, and we'll touch base a little bit on the chronic stuff later. But again, like we've all been there where we've sprained an ankle or we've had a cut and something's happened and then all of a sudden it's puffy. That's typical inflammation. So let's get into the science of it.
So what is inflammation? It's the immune system's response to foreign invaders, wounds, and damaged tissue. If you have experienced a sprained ankle, the tissue surrounding your ankle joint probably swelled up, something we call inflammation. Many of us probably treated the inflammation with rest, ice, and elevation. We'll talk more on that later. But acute inflammation, which is what that is, like one injury, one cut, one rolled joint, happens when the body first notices pathogens, damaged cells, or irritants, including injury. Inflammation is a defense mechanism our bodies take in an attempt to heal. Inflammation works to self-protect and is our first step in healing. I think that's important for us to think about when a lot of times we're taking anti-inflammatory things to stop that healing process that's natural in our bodies. In fact, an inflammatory response allows for our bodies to heal from wounds and infections. The puffiness that surrounds this acute injury is inflammation and what we typically hear as white blood cells. These white blood cells, or leukocytes, are our first line of defense and make up the innate immune system. This is something the author of our handbook defines, Robbins, as two types of immune system, innate and acquired, also known as adaptive. So the latter being that which develops from memory or specific invaders and grows with repetitive exposure. So think chicken pox. If we're going to imagine that our white blood cells as our own internal army, those leukocytes have army generals, majors, and cadets. The generals are neutrophils, who encompass invaders and eat them up. The majors are monocytes, which eat pathogens and become macrophages in tissues. That's kind of like the stuff in our guts. We probably aren't going to get to that today. The lymphocytes are our cadets, and as their name implies, they reside primarily in the lymph fluid and release antibodies. The macrophages are kind of like the bring out your dead and carry away dead invaders. So how do these cells know about the foreign invaders? One type in particular is kind of like the special forces, or like the Lone Ranger, patrolling the blood vessel walls for foreign invaders in like a mission to seek and destroy. Our book's author, Robbins, considers them polymorphonuclear neutrophils. And it's like they have a little radio. So the poly part of that means that they kind of like spread out, right? Poly means multiple as opposed to like mono. So they're cells, but they have like kind of like these little feet that hang out. They get lodged in a thing, and then they got this little radio. They communicate back to the homies like, hey, there's a foreign invader. And they also stay there and test it to be like, hey, this is like a major threat, call everybody in or not. So that monitors the strength of the invader and it calls on the reserves. So we have all of these neutrophils. Like there's a little bit of languaging issue here because a lot of them are leukocytes, because that's really what kind of white blood cells we're talking about are the leukocytes. But sometimes they're called neutrophils, phalanges, like just all these different things. If you want to look into it, do more research. There's also like killer T cells, like it's pretty cool stuff, but they're all responsible for different pieces in the immune system, but most of them are white blood cells or lymphatic fluid. And so as we talk about the circulatory system, everything's moving around with the blood within our body. We learned a lot about the capillaries, how everything's constantly in motion, and how the breath actually directs that as well, which is really cool. So as the neutrophils start to gobble up invaders, so there's like those different layers where they're gobbling them up, or they're starting to fight them, or they're releasing antibodies. And those ones that release the antibodies are really like the lymphocytes, right? Part of the lymphatic system that does that. So guess what happens when all these cells are dead or done, like the invader cells? Well, also the cells that eat them up, those eventually die too, because all cells end up dying, right? Your body regenerates all the time. They turn into something, it's kind of interesting. Can you guess it? Pus. Right? Isn't that so awesome? So you have like this huge inflammation on your arm or something from a cut, and then all of your white blood cells are doing all this work to like make it better, and then they collect and turn into pus. Beautiful, beautiful work, body. So we talked a lot about like acute inflammation, the different systems that are involved, which the immune system itself is comprised of several different systems that help the body reach wellness and equilibrium, including the autonomic nervous system, the skeletal system with the bone marrow, we have the lymphatic system, and then we also have the endocrine system. So there's a lot going on, but we often just think about it as the circulation within just the circulatory system with blood vessels and stuff. But most of what's in our body is those fluid patterns, right? So even our fascia, right? Haven't heard that enough from me. But even that is the extracellular matrix. Like it's all fluid patterns, and that's how we develop in utero. So it's a really beautiful thing how they all kind of go hand in hand together. So one thing that happens though is with chronic inflammation. So not just like you get a cut, it swells up, you do these things, it heals, whatever. Like there's a lot of people, myself included at one point, that have chronic inflammation where the immune system starts to attack itself.
So normally all of those little guys, the little military, are going out there and trying to attack those things, and then once it's cleared out, they're pus, they're gone, it's good. But sometimes they continue to think that there's foreign invaders that aren't necessarily foreign invaders, and that can come out as food allergies. It can go into like more hardcore issues like Crohn's, arthritis, all sorts of stuff. So it's really important for us to keep our immune system in check. And one of the great ways that yoga does is it helps balance the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, so the parasympathetic and sympathetic stay in check. And that's one line of defense that we have for it, right? And then we've also learned a lot of good stuff about the endocrine system, the glandular support that we have, and you know, that all comes up to the HPA axis. So we have all of these great tools within yoga to help build a stronger immune system, and that's one of the things that we preach as yogis, is that we're gonna benefit our immune system by doing regular yoga asana. Anyways, mahalo you guys, aloha, I'll see you guys real soon. Have a great, fantastic break.